afternoon. I'm Courtney Bailey with Leadership Austin.
And I'm Trenzio Turner with Austin PBS.
So this is the second week of Black History Month, and today we are having a timely conversation on lessons learned from workplace anti-racism trainings. While preparing for this topic, we asked ourselves, what does an anti-racist workplace look like? So for starters, a work environment that proactively tackles racism helps Black employees and employees of color feel safe, respected, and connected. It improves Black persons and people of color's whole health, which includes their mental, emotional, psychological, and physical well-being.
Workplace anti-racism practices also creates environments where people of color and Black people can increase their lifetime earnings, career development, and security. It also creates an inclusive company that reflects diversity of our region. And all of this work intersects with gender, sexual orientation, and other inequities.
Now, before we introduce our panel, we would like to highlight a few terms that we'll use throughout this conversation, such as anti-racism, which means to actively change policies, behaviors, and beliefs that perpetuate white supremacy culture, racist ideology, and actions. We'll also discuss anti-blackness, a form of racism that specifically denigrates, disenfranchises, and disavows people racialized as Black in order to uphold white supremacy.
In addition, we will touch on unconscious bias, which refers to social stereotypes about certain groups of people held unconsciously, and we will address DEI, a commonly used acronym that stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. To help us with this conversation, we have invited Sharon Brogdon, founder and CEO of Illuminations Consulting, a full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting company.
We also have Dilawri Gandhi, CEO and founder of D. Gandhi Communications, a strategic communications firm supporting nonprofits and social impact entrepreneurs.
Next is David Gonzalez, Divisional Director of Certification Programs at Courageous Conversation, an award-winning protocol for effectively engaging, sustaining, and deepening interracial dialogue.
And lastly, we have Christine McCary, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate and former lawyer. Welcome, everyone.
All right, let's jump into our first question. In the workplace, DEI, anti-racism, and unconscious bias trainings are often used interchangeably. What are your thoughts on this? And does the term you use matter? So Sharon, we're going to start with you. Does the term you use matter? Can they be interchangeable?
Thank you, Trenzio, for that question. And I think the terms should not be interchangeable. I think each of them reflects a particular aspect of the bigger picture and entire conversation. And so it's important to give each one of those aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, et cetera, their own due and their own focus.
Good. They all need space to breathe. Yeah. All right. David, your thoughts on it?
Yeah, good afternoon. And I agree absolutely with what Sharon offered. And we know in our work, language matters. And so when we start using these terms and start using them interchangeably, it could lead to confusion and misunderstandings. And so when we look at these terms, really the work we do is centering on race and understanding what is my story in race, what's the organizational story in race. And so having that as the starting point allows us to really unpack all these terms and see, how does this fit in my lived experience? How does this fit in the organization's experience?
Thank you, David. Christine?
I agree with everything that David and Sharon have said. I also think that using acronyms and euphemisms too much takes away from this racial justice work that underpins almost everything we do.
Right. And Dilawri?
I agree as well. And I'm in communications, so I'm a little bit biased. I think we need to use our words carefully and accurately whenever possible. But I will also raise for folks that may be in different parts of their journey in their workplace that sometimes the most important phrase you use is the one that engages your audience as deeply as possible. You want people to participate. And so I think, people come in with different levels of understanding about all these different terms. And so what's really important is to engage your audience and then define what these things mean for your workplace and for this journey that you're on.
Great. Thank you all.
So now I have a follow-up question. Anti-blackness is another form of racism. So why is it important to name anti-blackness? And are there any lessons learned in addressing anti-blackness in DEI and racial equity work? And David, I'll start with you with this one.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. Yes, it is absolutely important to name it because we need to understand what we're working against. And so to understand what anti-blackness is, what that means, how that shows up. In addition, we need to be able to know how we go about talking about this. So it can't be just like, let's just jump in and start having this conversation about anti-blackness. It's what does it mean? How am I navigating this conversation? How are others navigating the conversation? And so we need a formalized way within our organizations to go about really unpacking what this looks like.
Thank you, David. Sharon?
Yes, I totally agree with what David has brought up. And in my experience, what I have seen too is unless we name it directly and speak to it directly, it's so easy for organizations to muddle things together. And then we end up really not addressing the true issue and the true challenges. And understanding how anti-blackness impacts me as a Black woman, our Black employees, as well as those in the majority population that we need as allies.
Thank you, Sharon. So you and David both say we have to name it. Delari?
Yes, agreed. We have to name it. Being Black in America is not the same as being any other race in America. All non-Black people, even marginalized groups, are in a position to perpetuate anti-Blackness and to stay in a stratified system that really prioritizes white supremacy. And so it's important that we name it before we can address it.
Christine?
I really like what Delara just said in particular because I believe strongly that we are all connected. Race is a construct, but racism is a reality, and not naming anti-Black racism when you do this work is not doing the work. So breathing through the heart requires taking risks and making a difference in meaningful ways to redress the horrific history on which our currently disunited states are based.
I like what you said. Race is a construct, but racism is a reality. Yeah.
Sharon, over the past few years, DEI roles, unconscious bias, and anti-racism trainings have been on the rise. What qualifies an individual or company to facilitate this work? And what should organizations look for in a partner to guide them through this process?
Excellent question. And you're absolutely right. It has been on the rise. The spotlight is shining ever brightly. I applaud those organizations that want to participate and those individuals that want to be a part of the solution. What I would say, what qualifies an individual to be a part of leading organizations through these conversations and through this work is really some type of credibility in the space. Whether that's a certification through a program or an organization that has a track record of success and a track record of taking organizations through this work. I would say what the organization should look for is someone that's going to have the direct conversation with them and be open to those direct conversations. If they are not at a point of cultural readiness to engage in these types of conversations, they need to be open to hearing that and open to doing the work that it requires to be able to begin making a difference in this space.
Right. Have a track record of success, be willing to do the work, not just talk about it, but actually get into it. All right. Thank you, Sharon.
So David, I have a two-part question for you. First, how do you as a consultant assess where organizations are in the transformation process of becoming an anti-racist company? And second, have you received any pushback or had any disagreements with clients, staff, or leadership, and how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. I think one of the key words you bring up, Courtney, is transformation. And what is the desire of an organization to truly transform who they are when it comes to racial equity? And so one way I use that is through the understanding of will, like understanding one's will, skill, knowledge, capacity. And understand their will is your will to do something very performative that's just going to be for the next 2 months, but after these 2 months, we're going to go back to our old ways of being? Or are we really seeking to transform who we are, how we show up in the world, what we offer to the world? And so we start there in wondering, is this organization really committed to that systemic transformation, which we know is impairment to having racial equity? In regards to the second question, when have we received pushback or disagreements with clients or leadership? That really is when we start going through that transformation. We're pushed into these areas of discomfort, into having new ways of thinking, hearing different perspectives, into these new ways of considering of how we're going to move forward in our performative ways, new ways of maybe believing as well. And when we go through that, there's some initial resistance because we find comfort in the old ways. Like we know what the old ways were for the good and the bad. And sometimes when we're reimagining what that future could look like through that transformation, it creates some disequilibrium. And sometimes people want to disengage as a result of that.
And you said something that was interesting. You said performative, and we're going to talk about that later. But it's easier, I think, to be performative than to like be in that discomfort and work through that to get to that transformation piece. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of performative, this next question has some of that in it. In the past 2 years, many organizations and companies have been quick and eager to release statements, press releases, and action steps to show their support and solidarity for different communities of color. Some would say this is performative allyship, or the act of publicly signaling solidarity against social injustices and inequities without actually challenging the systems and being genuine, like you were just saying earlier, David, about the actual issues that are at play. Delari, what happens when an organization's message or mission doesn't align with their behaviors and actions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think is more and more in our regular conversation. And I think we're really talking about two different things here, right? We're talking about external communications and we're talking about internal communications with your own team in an organization or a company. And both, like any relationship, are based in trust. Are you going to do what you said you're going to do? And how will you prove that you did it, right? So we remember the black squares after George Floyd's murder, and a lot of companies release these statements, as you mentioned, about where they stand and what they want to do. But I always say that content needs to follow decisions, right? Your statement can't lead the work. You need to actually be committed to doing the work before you say it out loud. And I think all leaders need to think about why they said those things. And if it's because you felt you had to, or because you were scared to lose business, then I think it's important to examine that and be realistic about the potential backlash of being caught in your own insecurity there, right? And the mismatch of what you say and what you do is noticed more and more often by smart customers. And if you work somewhere that promised something that it isn't delivering on, I think we all have to note that you have the responsibility to change this, because each of us represents the culture of our workplace. So I think this is really about retaining your team, keeping business, and really committing to do what you say, and then honestly follow up with some way to measure and talk about it with clarity. Because if you're not ready to back up your statements with action, it's a whole different conversation around whether you were ready to start in the first place, and culture that needs to happen internally. To some of the points that were made earlier, these are things that are, a little bit of an internal conversation sometimes before it's an external one.
Right. Yeah, I love that you talk about that public face and then that private face, right? Making sure that the private is squared away before you even show anything outside the house, right?
That's right. Get your house in order before you step out.
See? My grandmother taught me that a long time ago.
Right.
So, Christine, the next question is for you, but we also have an audience question for you. So maybe you can merge that. So
Sure.
I hope I said her name right. Rosalinda Howard asked, who is Christine and why is she a former lawyer? So that's one. Then I wanted to ask you, so if you can but the question I have for you also is, so oftentimes Black people and people of color are reliving out their trauma in anti-racism work. So Christine, as a white person, how do you help shoulder the responsibilities and ensure that Black colleagues and colleagues of color aren't burdened with anti-racism work alone?
Thank you for the questions. Rosalinda or Linda, I am someone who just retired a couple of weeks ago as a DEI consultant. And prior to that, I was doing this work in tech, including legal operations. And prior to that, I was a lawyer for a long time. And I came from not a privileged background. And so ultimately I realized as a lawyer, even though I was a general counsel, that I was part of the problem and not part of the solution. So that's why I made that transition. And I understand it's a nonlinear path, but it's one that has served me well in terms of opening up my heart and mind. In terms of mistakes, I want to preface this by saying mistakes are going to happen. It's normal. I meet too many people, many of whom I love, who are afraid of making a mistake, and so they don't step into the work. And it's better to have ventured and made mistakes and addressed your mistakes than to not have ventured at all, because this work is too important to ignore that. I think that there are 3 principles that have guided me throughout this work, particularly with anti-racism, because racialized trauma, even if you've been traumatized, is different. It affects the mind, body, and spirit differently for Black people than it does for, say, for myself. So the 3 prongs I always operate under are self-educate, actively listen, and intentionally act. In terms of self-education, I did attend Courageous Conversations, which David has spoken of, and really thought it was a great immersive experience, non-polarizing. I also read extensively. In terms of nonfiction, I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about racialized trauma, books like My Grandmother's Hands, The Body Keeps the Score, Minda Hart's new book, Right Within, many other resources. And if you want to look into nonfiction because you're not quite ready to go that route, I really recommend The Vanishing Half and The Love Songs of W.E. Du Bois to read and understand more about racialized trauma, especially if you're white. In terms of actively listening, I talk to and listen to my many Black friends and former colleagues. I partner with a lot of organizations, and I only am actively listening if they want to talk about it. In terms of intentionally acting, you have to create environments and spaces where the work can be done safely and inclusively. That sounds really easy. It's not. It requires a lot of back channel working to make sure leaders are on board, that middle managers aren't going to get in the way. It requires partnering always. I've never done anti-racism training. I always partner with interested, experienced practitioners with the lived experience, and I partner with them and support them. I try not to refer people if I think they're moving into a bad environment. I've made really bad mistakes, really egregious mistakes, and I've learned from all of them. Probably one of my most painful mistakes was early in consulting. I believed leadership when they told me at a certain client that they were going to walk the path, that we were going to start off with, I was going to do a DEI 101 workshop, and we were going to move into reviewing systems, policies, and procedures, and also bring on qualified, interested practitioners to talk about anti-Black racism, social justice, and other issues. And instead what happened is, in the workshop I did initially to kick it off, this was a tech company, I did do a discussion. You can't do a workshop and not talk about anti-Black racism and privilege and decentering whiteness. We went through that exercise on privilege, and afterwards I learned that somebody who worked at the company, a team member, was bullied in the break room about privilege. And this was heartbreaking because the company subsequently ghosted on what we were going to do together, on the people I was bringing on board to do the work. And I learned from that experience to create a more strategic document or RFP at the outset to ensure that you're bringing in people who you know have the grit and the knowledge and the bravery to do this work. And you're not going to unintentionally also hurt team members because they're speaking up or experiencing things in real time that affect them without the support they need. And that was a critical lesson for me right out of the gate.
Christine, you mentioned something that was really interesting. We talk about the organization, right? But then it's the individuals in there too that we sometimes overlook, that perpetuate that behavior, and then the organizations have to make a decision. What are you going to do, right?
Right.
And so that's really, thank you for saying that. Shinzio?
Yeah, absolutely. I know Courtney just read a question from the chat. I think we may have some more coming in here. I'm going to throw this out to the group. It says, do you have an estimate of the percentage of companies that have a racist workplace? And this question is from Don Dunlap. Do you have an estimate of the percentage of companies that have a racist workplace? Anyone care to take that one on?
I don't have an estimate on a data point, but I will say this. I think that racism in its very nature is structural and fundamental to this country. So if you have a workplace in this country, it is highly likely that you have some amount of racist practices that are harming people of color and specifically Black people in your company. So I would hesitate to say 100%, but there is no real escape from racism. If it's not happening inside of your workplace, then it is likely that your workplace is influenced by outside factors that you cannot control. It is influenced by your local, federal, state government. There are lots of things here that are at play that are not unique to any specific workplace, but that actually we all experience. And so any amount of racism is too much racism. And I would encourage us all to think about that.
That's a great point. Thank you for that. It's great education to know that the racism can come from multiple places. It may not necessarily be, you may not think it's necessarily there, but when you look at all the ways it can enter, the likelihood is that it is there. So, all right, let's go to our next group of questions. And this next round, it's going to be back open to the group. So we're going to throw it out for anyone to answer. We touched on this earlier, but can we take a moment to share the impact of having executive leaders actively comment on anti-racism strategies and trainings in the workplace? And David, I'm going to direct this one at you first, based off of what you do with Courageous Conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It is such foundational to the work to have executive leaders be actively involved in the work they're doing as an organization. That when we think about systemic transformation, that implies the entire system. And if the executive leaders feel like they're exempt from that, and this is only for one branch of the organization or for lower levels, the work's really not going to transform systematically. And so when we think of systemic transformation, it requires everyone. The power in that is that when leaders truly do this work, they're able to understand at a much deeper level what is their story within this as well. And so understanding how has race impacted my life, how has it shown up, both from the positive all the way to the negative incomes, that they're then able to answer the question in their organizations, what does race have to do with this? What does race have to do with the disparities that exist within our organization? And here's my story in that. And so examples would be, we've worked closely with the superintendent and deputy superintendent from a large school district on the East Coast. They go through our work, and now they're ever ready to bring on more and more of their people from their organization, but they understand their story so they can help lead, which their positions require.
I love that, the personal reflection that comes from doing this work, right? And how that will ultimately help your organization overall. Mm-hmm. That's great.
I'd like to speak to that a little bit. I've worked with quite a few executives for good or bad. And one thing I've noticed is sometimes you actually are able to build an intersectional lens, to use Kimberly Crenshaw's term, where you can understand the intersection of multiple marginalized identity or historically excluded groups. And a leader will be on board, and initiatives, a systemic oppression, other initiatives that are worked on in the company get underway. And then the middle managers become an issue. And that to me is something that is interesting, because some leaders will say, well, this middle manager is an issue and not supporting the team members doing this work, but he, she, they is my best engineer. And you can build an intersectional lens with a leader, including if they go to excellent training or do their own self-education, but they have to be able to commit all the way down through their reporting chain. And I have noticed that middle managers tend to be some of the most difficult challenges when you're doing the work. And some who say they're neutral, it requires a lot of energy to be neutral, and that can become an issue too.
And if I could just piggyback too off of both of what David has said and Christine has said, when we think about the executive leadership and overall organizational transformation, the leadership needs to recognize that they set the tone for the entire company and how this work is going to be received. And trust me, all of these organizations hire really smart people, and they are watching. They're watching to see how serious their leadership is. Are they just speaking or talking the talk? Are they actually invested in walking the walk? And in this age of the Great Resignation, talent is making a choice as to where they want to place their talent. And they will make decisions based on what they see their leadership do and what they see their managers do on the day-to-day. And are they backing up the language that they're using and the words that they're using in their actions?
I would also love to add a piece of advice that I give to clients and to others, which is when you're not speaking and when you're not sharing with your staff internally from leadership's perspective, like if you, as a leader, if you're not sharing regularly, following up on what you promised, saying anything about what you're working on, folks will fill in the blank for you. And you don't want that. You do not want that. Your staff will fill in that blank that you are not filling in, and they will not be generous. So just be aware of that from a leadership point of view, because that is just how we all naturally operate. It's human nature to say like, oh, okay, well, they promised me a new anti-racism workshop. They promised me somebody that would be hired on the leadership team to work on these issues. And then none of those things materialize. It must be because they don't care. And so if there's a reason other than you don't care, which is a different conversation, if there's a reason other than you don't care, it's really important to be communicative with your team from the leadership's perspective. Otherwise, rumors float.
Don't leave a void there. Fill it in.
So, y'all, we have quite a few audience questions, and we're going to take them in order. Now, this next one might be tough, but it is in line with a question that I have, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. It's from Ann Dinkler, and Ann asks, do you have a list of companies who have undergone DEI training for their employees? Anyone would like to chime in? Sharon, I see you.
So I'll jump in on that one real quickly. I don't have an exhaustive list, but there are organizations that do put lists out regarding companies and their progress in this work. And I would say the ones that are in the forefront are the ones that are releasing their work and their progress, and they're holding themselves accountable publicly. Fortune 500 puts out a list. Working Mother Magazine now, Saramount puts out a list. So there are several lists that you can look at to see who is really committed to this work and who and how are they progressing over time.
And speaking of Fortune 500, so in 2021, Fortune 500 listed the top 20 companies with the best diversity, equity, and inclusion numbers. And so the first thing that comes to mind is who gets to decide this? And is it enough to be the best DEI, to be the best at DEI when addressing anti-racism in the workplace?
These lists can be good and bad. The bad is that sometimes they're pay to play, so you have to pay if you want to participate in the process. The bad also can be that if you go through whatever the certification is, for example, to be on a list, there's no teeth, so there's no follow-up to make sure that the work that has been promised actually gets done. I think a good model where that doesn't happen would be for a B Corp, for example, B Corporation. Also, if you're on these selection committees, 40 under 40, 30 under 30, whatever it might be locally or even regionally, you often see that even within those well-intentioned spaces, there is a bit of an echo chamber, and you sometimes need to be vocal several years to get folks who typically aren't recognized. So it's a boon and a burden, but I agree that it's an understandable and necessary question. Who is the gatekeeper here, and why do we need that gatekeeper? Why isn't this just the way it is?
All right, sorry, Courtney.
Go ahead, Trizia.
All right. We had some great questions coming in here. This is another one from Cynthia Martinez, and says, how can employees of color address or respond to performative actions in the workplace to move those conversations into productive spaces? Anyone care to take that on, going from performative to productive?
I think it's really, thanks. I think it's really important for employees of color, particularly Black employees, right, to think about whether or not you want the additional side hustle of carrying this for your company. You will be unpaid, you will be exhausted, and you will probably not make a ton of progress if you're the one leading this effort without the support of white employees, other employees of color, folks who hold power in your company. And so I think it's really, really, really important to really think hard about how you want to engage in these efforts and whether you feel like your work will take you forward or will take the company forward. I think moving these conversations to productive spaces requires multiple folks engaging on a very consistent basis over a long period of time. This is not a conference room where we all cry because the police killed somebody today. That is not what this is, right? This is ongoing work. It's all the time. And it is taking into consideration people's experiences that, frankly, it's much easier not to, right? We talked about comfort earlier, but that's not what this work is. So I think my point overall is that if you're a person of color in a workplace hoping to move this conversation forward, just be sure you're working on a team and with a group of people, and that you're not really out here banging that drum by yourself, because not only do you then hold all the work and all the emotional labor and all the, extra time, physical labor of actually appearing at all of these workshops and meetings that you are now leading, but you will also potentially walk away from it completely empty-handed and also branded in the workplace as that person that's always talking about race because you're by yourself and you're a single voice. So my caution is very much around wanting to persevere in the workplace, right? As people of color, as women of color, as Black people specifically, that perseverance requires a lot of intentional boundary making and holding, right? Hold those boundaries after you make them.
I'm a fake extrovert, and the book Quiet about introverts was really meaningful for me to step out when I wasn't comfortable with it. And one tactic that can help with what we're talking about is when employees, team members see significant gaps between what's happening versus the blah, 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 asking your tech or other departments, your IT department, to add Google Audience tools or other truly anonymous tools, Slido, into team settings or company-wide settings so that you can ask questions about perceived propaganda, real or imagined, it's probably real, without feeling exposed. I think it's really important to protect quieter people because they often have the best ideas, especially among people of color. They're seeing a lot more than you are. And that's a nice way to try to get around that issue so you're not as exposed and carrying that burden.
And I would just add too that if there is an individual or that is leading the DEI effort for the organization or a DEI council, it's a way to kind of enable the organization an opportunity to put their money where their mouth is. So if there is an entity that is driving that effort for the company, you can share your thoughts, share your opinions with them, and they can bring it to leadership to say, this is how the organization is responding. This is what they're seeing. They're seeing that our actions are not necessarily conforming with what we've promised.
Okay. So let me ask you kind of a follow-up on that. Who is ultimately accountable to continue the anti-racism work? Right? Is it leadership? Is it frontline staff? Is it both? Right? And what does accountability look like beyond training?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, David.
No, Sharon, please.
I would just say, this work does not rest on the shoulders of one individual. If you're going to have an organizational transformation, everyone has a role to play. And when I said that leadership sets the tone, they have to be the role models. If they're not actively and visibly putting action into place, then no one else is going to follow.
Yeah, and to add what Sharon just said, I agree with her 100%. And to know nobody's exempt from this. So it's that dual lens of it's going to require everyone, and I don't get to disengage myself because that committee is going to do it, or only the people of color are going to do it, or all those ways we could think of reasons to disengage from the work. That accountability rests with the whole and the self. And so you got to look at it through both lenses.
That's great. Thank you.
Christina, I saw you wanted to say something. You good?
I'm sitting on my hands. I'm really excited we're talking about this so candidly because those of us who've been doing it know how very, very hard it is and what the toll it takes and the space we have to make for keeping ourselves upright and how it can affect your health. And It is everyone's responsibility, and maybe in organizations, I found this in the fintech sector especially. You need to build community first before you start educating more, because a lot of times there's no community inside the organization. And studying something like the People's History of the United States, so you even know our history, is a way to start to build community. It's everybody's responsibility.
Right. And earlier, I'm gonna read some comments and then get to an audience question. But earlier, Christine, you said something about quiet people, and I want to make a differentiation. I think I said that word wrong. But so I'm quiet, like I'm an introvert, right? But I speak up, right? Because silence. So it's a difference being quiet and then like silent.
Mm-hmm.
Silence can be violent, right? Mm-hmm. And so knowing when to speak up, right? And so I speak up because like my life depends on it, my livelihood. And so knowing, when you should speak up, because sometimes when you're quiet, that is harmful too, like silent, Yeah. So we have a comment from CF Martin. I'm so glad you said that, because BIPOC, I think it's to Delari. I'm so glad that you said that, Delari, because BIPOC doing DEI work is complicated. I really feel like that it takes white people stepping up, because burnout is real when you're also holding the fact that it's requiring you to validate your existence and experience too. I love that statement from CF Martin. And then Alejandro Victoria asks, how do you refill your tank in doing this work for those who do this work on a regular basis? Going back to that burnout and fatigue. Who would like to, y'all all look like, oh, I'm burnt out right now.
Well, I'll just, go ahead, Delari.
I think I'm going to try to stay in the healthy lane of how we deal with some of these issues. But I think, part of what is really important, one, is to get professional mental health if you are able to access it and you can afford it. I think that has been a game changer for a lot of folks who are trying to, maybe for the first time, even as people of color, reckon with what they're facing on a day-to-day basis and the toll that it takes. It's real. And I think that too often we are kind of in a position of having to feel like it's not real, right? Because people will tell you it's not real. And so I think that's the first. I think the second piece is having as many authentic conversations with people in your life that you can, with whatever their background is, whatever their experience is. Find trusted people and communicate with them that you are experiencing these issues in your workplace and that you're tired. It is tiring. It's fair to say that out loud in the way you would anything else. And I think third, disengagement is important sometimes. It's important to take breaks. It's important to reset yourself and recommit yourself in whatever that looks like and adjust, right? So sometimes the action that we take first to address an issue isn't the right one or isn't the sustainable one, and those are two things that are really important. Are you taking action that's correct for you in your spirit and in your mind? And also, is it sustainable for you in the longer term? And taking the time to reflect and think about that and adjust accordingly is really important. Whatever you say first doesn't have to be the only thing. Whatever you commit to first doesn't have to be the only thing. You need to really take care of yourself if you want to sustain in every part of your work.
And that's real, especially for like the BIPOC folks who hold that space too. Sharon, I know you wanted to say something.
Yes, I would just echo everything Delari said. And I think the biggest piece for me in my experience was really just to acknowledge that it exists, that burnout is real. This is very, for those that do this, that I have seen full time, it's a personal commitment. There is a deep sense of the importance of this work and wanting to make a difference. So that acknowledgement of the fact that, yep, it does take a toll, and it can take a toll if it's not addressed is super important. And then I would say the other thing that I realized within my career is, again, not every company or organization is ready for this work to be full on, and sometimes it takes baby steps. I've had organizations where I've had to tell them, I know this is what you want to accomplish, but this is where you are in your overall journey. So let's take some baby steps to get us there. And organizations that have not been open to it, I've had to walk away from. And I've done that for my own sanity. And I've done that because of my own beliefs.
I'd like to applaud that, because I think some of us have walked away from brand when we were aware that we'd gone as far as we could within the organization, and perhaps we needed to move out to make space for others, or perhaps we needed to move out because we were burned out, or perhaps we needed to move out because we didn't see that the gap was ever going to be closed, or combination of those things. But Sharon and Delaria are so on point that the emotional underpinning is hard to articulate in words of the work, even when you're white, and you have to be prepared to lose friends and social capital. Yet what I look at most of the time is what I've gained, and that's the richness and complexity of the friendships I've developed instead, and what it's like to have a truly intersectional lens and then move through the world that way. It builds compassion in a way that also cannot properly be articulated.
Thank you. David, you want to add anything?
Yeah, my big key takeaway is like this work requires interdependence. It requires collaboration, and internally knowing that I don't have to shoulder this alone, that who are the people that are walking this journey with me and navigating every step of the way. So whether you're early in your work of anti-racism, if you're middle career, end of the career, how am I navigating this, and who are the people coming along this journey with me? It takes away that burden of feeling like you're on an island and have to carry everything yourself.
Thank you for that. So we have quite a few comments and questions. So I'm going to read a comment, and it's kind of long, but maybe you all will want to respond to it. It's from James Philly. I think I said your name right, James. Oftentimes, and even on this call, I hear about diversity numbers. The question I have is, it isn't statistically possible for every company to be diverse. We're all just fighting for the same diverse talent. So what does being a diverse company really mean? Also, not everyone cares about diversity. For me, we build initiatives, our CEO supports, but we have little to no participation in even the smallest initiatives. And then he has a part two. So I went from being passionate to not really caring to drive the work anymore. Anybody want to comment on that? Delaria, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that if you are someone who cares about these issues and feels that you're doing your best to get engagement in your workplace and are not receiving it, that it becomes incredibly discouraging to continue. I would also offer that I think what we are talking about here are practices that encourage diversity in the workplace, which means a lot of different things, which is why we started this conversation around what is the difference between diversity and inclusion and fighting anti-blackness and anti-race and, holding up anti-racism practices in your workplace. These are all really different things, right? So if we're talking about initiatives that are not garnering support inside of your organization, then it is necessary to think about a cultural shift, right? There are lots of things that people do in a workplace that aren't directly tied to the work itself necessarily, or are potentially, what are considered extracurricular. And if the situation is that you're not getting engagement, I think then the question becomes, one, is that the right workplace for you if you are passionate about these issues? And are you so passionate about these issues that it determines where you work, which I think it does for a lot of people? And two, if you are in a position to engage more people yourself personally, then what can be done differently? I think this is a question of, what does discouragement mean for you? And does it mean a move to inaction, or does it mean the motivation to do something differently and better, and in a way to receive feedback that requires the active listening that folks have mentioned on this call? And at the end of the day, what does it mean to say, we are making progress in this area or we're not? And how are you measuring that? So for me, it really is a question of like, that discouragement can lead to inaction. I think that's fair, and everyone's allowed to do what they need to do. But I think discouragement can also lead to increased and better action that engages more people. And it's really about how you want to approach it in your own workplace.
Exactly. If you are in an organization where there isn't a concerted effort to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, look in your own role and see what you can do. Are you a quality assurance engineer and you're wondering if the algorithms are training on data sets that have bias in them? Start looking at the Algorithmic Justice League, get to know more about AI bias. Are you in human resources and you realize that most people see HR as representing the organization rather than the people? What can you do to change that? Are you in recruiting and you're wondering if your applicant tracking system is fairly suited to all different types of people, but maybe some of the language in your job descriptions are biased? We know that putting salary negotiable in there, for example, helps women realize they can negotiate. There are a lot of different things you can do in role, in product, in all the different roles that are in an organization, even if your company isn't making a meaningful contribution, in your opinion, to the work. And there are nowadays so many more resources, including this one, where you can tune in and tune out the mess that's in your day-to-day and find community inside of your organization and make a difference.
I would
That's
like
great.
to also just tag on to something that I think was at the heart of this question, which is that there is a limited pool of diverse people that can be in any workplace, right? And I think the question here implies that there is some cap on the number of Black and brown people that are available for any particular workplace. And I think a lot of that goes back to, one, it's just not true, right? We know the numbers in Texas are changing significantly. Demographically, this is just false. And two, I think to what Christina's talking about, what are your hiring practices and rules like that are potentially leaving folks out of the equation, right? Are you requiring everyone to have a butt in a seat in a city like Austin, where it's very unaffordable to live here and generational wealth is a real issue in Black and brown communities? If those are your requirements, yes, of course, you will not have Black and brown candidates for your job. You just won't, right? Because I can't afford to live in the city and you want me to travel every single day to be at this office. So I think that there are, to Christine's point, initiatives, you know, a Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service, all really lovely, lovely things, but we're talking about the structure of your workplace and not just the initiative. So tackle things that are possible for you. And I would encourage everyone to think about that.
I want to try to slip one more audience question in here. This is from Robin Fay. She says, how can we as BIPOC employees bring our authentic self at the workplace? This question has come up a lot in some other things we've talked about before, but how can they sort of bring their authentic self to that environment? I know we touched on it a little bit, but we'd love to hear if you have anything more to say there.
David, you've been quiet.
Yeah, the authentic self is first being grounded in knowing who you are, how you show up, what's your story, what's your racial story, what's your cultural story, and how does that show up, and provide the opportunity for people to think about theirs as well. When we think about our authentic self, it implies this task of introspection, that we've done some introspection in understanding who we are and what we bring. And so for some of us, you may have done a lot of that work. For others, you're like, oh, I really never thought about it in that way. That we then invite others into conversations to think about that. What is authentic self? How does it show up within this culture of the organization in which we work? And what does this mean in the broader context for what we do? That gets to some of those bigger questions about structures and culture within an organization, specifically disparities that exist within those cultures and structures.
Jody Ann Bury, who's a wonderful friend and advocate, did a really interesting, has done some really interesting work around the stereotype of imposter syndrome, because sometimes you cannot show up as your authentic self. And so I encourage people to look at her work on that. Just put her name in, Jodi-Ann Burey, and imposter syndrome, and look at that, because we do need to acknowledge that sometimes people cannot show up as their authentic self. And that's okay too. The system needs to change. You don't always have to change yourself around the system.
I want to get in one more audience question. And I think it'll be quick. It's from Kathy Jones. And Kathy Jones asks, should DEI training with your staff be voluntary or mandatory? I see some nodding.
Also heard some little giggles there.
I would say it's mandatory, because no one's exempt from the work of DEI. That we all are a part of this that has been created. The social construction that we talk about, race, I like to use the example, like no one is exempt from checking a box on the census, right? Everyone has been racialized. While some people have a much clearer understanding of what that means and what it means in the organization, no one is exempt for it. So I absolutely believe it should be a mandatory part of all organizations.
I think go ahead. Go ahead, Sharon.
Oh, no, I was just going to piggyback off of that and say, again, for me, it goes back to leadership sets the tone. and they have to be committed to it. So it's not that you can just go and sit through a training and put the book back on the shelf and say, check that box. It really has to be emphasized as a priority and folks held accountable for what they take away from that training by the leadership.
And it's more than a training too. We want to acknowledge that it's you got to ingrain this in your day to day. It's trial and error, and you got to keep trying. Yeah, so it's so just because you do a training doesn't mean that you got it right. And I want to before we go into the call to action, and Trinity is going to kick us into that. I want to note something. Right, we've called out like anti-blackness quite a bit, but I want to point out that racism isn't just like black and white. It involves, like you all said before, all of us. And then sometimes I know when we focus on like anti-blackness, and I was intentional to bring that out, then it creates like this other thing that happens with other people of color too, right? Where it's like comparison, and there's no need to compare. This is just something that we need to try to work through, right? Does that make sense? Do y'all see what I'm trying to say? You want to say it nicer and sexier than I just said it?
It's not a competition. Racism is not a competition. Unfortunately, we all suffer from it. You can be a white person with a lot of wealth and you still suffer from it because all of our systems are unfortunately failing and primarily because of racism, right? We keep a lot of things in a lot of communities out of reach for a lot of people. And that's something that impacts all of us at a global and local level. So I agree with you, Courtney. We're calling out anti-blackness on purpose, but racism is more pervasive. And
they're like subgroups, like colorism is a part of racism, right? So like all of those things that we, folks say, it's not in my country. It is, right? Yeah. I just wanted to point that out. Chizio?
All right. Now, that's a great point, Courtney. As the great Dr. Colette Pierce Burnett would say, we don't have to engage in oppression Olympics to help and support each other, right? So we're going to move to our call to action, and it's a two-part call to action. The first part is, what's your call to action to the individual or colleague who is still grappling with issues of race and racism in the workplace? And second, what's your call to action for organizations seeking to move beyond just checking a box? And Delari, let's have you kick us off here.
So I think for folks who are grappling with this issue, I think there needs to be a certain amount of acceptance that this is a real situation and it is a real issue for your company or your organization's success. I think once we start to frame it that way, that this is an issue that is a cultural pillar in our organization, it becomes less about whether or not it's real, whether or not it's prevalent in my workplace, whether or not you have an example of it from someone that you know. It becomes much more a part of just your day-to-day thinking and whether or not you're able to identify and call out issues of racism in your workplace. And I think that's the really important part. Can you identify these things and can you voice those concerns more broadly in your organization?
All right, thank you. Christine?
I think the call to action for individuals, for me, really keys to this points I talked about earlier, which is you need to self-educate, actively listen, and intentionally act. It's not enough to watch a couple of wonderful shows on PBS or here. It's not enough to read a few books. You have to build your intersectional lens so that you can help create equitable outcomes. And part of that is educating yourself. Part of that is putting yourself in situations where you can actively listen to the experiences of other people, places you may not have been before. And then you become more equipped, better equipped to intentionally act, which helps make a real meaningful difference. These are stages, and you can't expect to have it all mastered right away. And you must know that you're going to make mistakes. But a lot of times, if you make mistakes and people see that your intentions are good and that you are ready to rectify the mistakes and move forward, you will be able to keep going. Don't think that making a mistake is going to prohibit you from doing the work.
Thank you, Christine. David?
Yeah, I would echo what has already been stated and just add in that using your voice, that you're making an act of the will to stay engaged in this. Too often when people are facing issues of race and racism in the workplace, they suppress it. and for a variety of reasons, fear, embarrassment, whatever it may be. And then it just starts eating away at one's spirit. So using your voice amongst trusted people, the organization at large, those are decisions for people to choose. But using your voice and staying engaged in that is going to be healthy for you and ultimately healthy for the organization.
All right, Sharon, you want to bring us home?
I would just say that if someone is grappling with whether racism in the workplace is real, if you can just presume that perhaps it is, I would say then if you are willing to say, just do the self-reflection and say, might I have contributed to this in some way, shape, or form? And this self-reflection doesn't have to be anything that you're telling the world that this is what I'm doing. Just as a starting point, start with that introspection and say, have I ever had thoughts, or is there anything that comes into my mind that may be contributing to these inequities that are happening within the workplace, if it is true? And then decide that you want to do something different and be a part of the solution.
So much great stuff on these calls to actions. I love that everything that you shared really comes back to being genuine and being real and being authentic, right? And even if you make mistakes, even if you may not get something right, but being purposeful about what you're doing. So thank you all for sharing those.
And y'all, we got a lot of comments, so I apologize to the folks that we weren't able to get to. Hopefully, if you fill out the survey and you put your comments in there, we can check in with the speakers and follow up with some of you if you share your email in that survey. So I want to say thank you to Sharon Brogdon, Delari Gandhi, David Gonzalez, and Christine McCary for sharing your lessons learned from workplace anti-racism trainings. It's clear that there is not always agreement on usefulness and directions these trainings should take, but it's important to continue having these conversations and continue actively working to create a racially just community.
And again, to our audience, we would love to know your thoughts on today's panel. So as Courtney mentioned, there's a comment section, there's a survey in the comments, so please go in there and fill out those 3 questions for us. And for next month, we're going to focus on creatives and artists in Austin and how they've been navigating things and faring throughout the pandemic. So we hope that you will join us in March for that. And thank you for joining us today, and take care of yourself and have a great day.
Bye, everyone.